we are Macroeconomics, lecture 23. We are back to business cycles. This is our fourth lecture on business cycles. What we do now is simply continue where we left off. Where we left off was 6 fundamental causes why, if there is a credit expansion, the boom ultimately ends. In other words, why the market forces a reversal on the boom and turns it into a bust. So what we left was that a boom inevitably ends into a bust. But before there is a bust, there is that short period in the economy which is called a crisis. And crisis is best defined in economic terms as a sudden loss of profitability amongst businesses and corporations. Crisis in financial markets is understood fundamentally different as a collapse in the stock markets, a collapse in the bond markets, collapses in other financial markets, could be derivatives, etc. In economics and in macro, we refer simply to corporate losses or loss of corporate profitability. So this is what a crisis is. Crisis is usually caused by a credit crunch. In other words, a lack of credit expansion. Differently stated, as long as credit expansion is available and accelerate, the boom continues. Once the acceleration slows down and turns into a deceleration or into an outright credit contraction, then a sudden crisis occurs and a depression or a bust is in order. So, what are the causes? Well, the first, or actually the only fundamental cause for a crisis and depression is that of shortage of savings. In other words, businesses invested as if there is an increase in savings. They started lengthening and widening the production structure, but because there wasn't an increase in the savings, somewhere along the process, there turns out to be a shortage of savings. Well, shortage of savings means that people did not save enough, but consumed more. So what is important to understand that business crises, at least within the Austrian framework that we're studying, are a result effectively of overconsumption. Now, the other cause that we have, and I mentioned last time, is that of temporal discoordination. Temporal discoordination means that because of a forceful lowering of interest rates or lower interest rates provide the wrong or incorrect signal to entrepreneurs as to widen and lengthen the production structure. So what effectively happens is that they overinvest in higher order capital goods. At the same time, what we are seeing is simultaneously an underinvestment in low order capital goods. This overinvestment on the one end and underinvestment in the other end is called malstructuring. So this is the overall malstructuring of the economy. So you have to remember, understand, the business crisis or depression doesn't result in overconsumption and doesn't result in underconsumption. It is caused by improper investing in higher order goods, meaning overinvesting there and underinvesting in the other end. Okay? So, what's cause number 3? Well, cause number 3 is what we've discussed already twice before, massive entrepreneurial errors. These errors are committed, it's important to understand, not because entrepreneurs are stupid or incompetent, but because they were misled by availability of credits early in the process of the boom. Any questions so far? Is it fairly clear? All right, so we move on to a large number of consequences. When the crisis hits, and remember the crisis is a sudden loss of profitability, if corporations or businesses, in other words, those that borrowed during the boom, if they don't have profits and their revenues more or less dry up, they are not able to serve their debts. If they're not able to serve their debts, they will default on them. So, number one is that inability to serve bank credit. Then number two is a result of number one, and this is massive bankruptcies. A bankruptcy is a declaration that a business or a person, let's call it an economic entity, is unable to serve its debts according to the arranged terms. This means that from that point on, courts will handle the process in accordance with bankruptcy laws. So, you have massive bankruptcies as a result of those massive overinvestments, which turn out to be not profitable and thereby not being able to serve their debts. As a result of those massive bankruptcies comes consequence number three, which is massive liquidations. To liquidate comes from the verb to make, or means to make liquid. To make liquid means to convert in cash. In other words, to liquidate means to sell assets so as to convert hard assets into liquid cash. Liquidation is the process of selling assets to convert into cash so as to satisfy debts. In other words, so as to satisfy usually a process of bankruptcies in order to satisfy prior bank credit. It is usually sold to some other third parties. They will usually buy it at a substantially lower price than what was it originally built on. In other words, what a liquidation does is get a very high order capital price, and in a forceful manner, usually through an auction, it will reduce dramatically the price of the asset. For example, you may have, let's say, a small business, and that business has been built for $100,000 or 100,000 euro, and turns out to be very unprofitable. So in a process of liquidation, which usually means that the assets are auctioned off, the highest bidder buys it for $40,000. Well, that's like a 60% off. Well, what is the function of it? Well, the function of it is that it effectively lowered dramatically the price of high order capital goods. And by lowering the price, it effectively performs one of the fundamental functions in a bust. I'll get to these summarized in a few minutes. Okay, so what we have as a consequence for? Well, as a consequence, you have overall losses of jobs. You also have overall losses of profitability. People sense that something's fundamentally wrong with the economy. Sometimes there is a depression in the form of sharply lower prices, so businesses can't move their goods. It may be, however, as in the case of the 70s, in a form of stagflation, that consumer prices keep rising and rising and rising, and people get financially hurt. They get hurt, as we discussed last time, because consumer prices rise a whole lot faster than wages, so workers' purchasing power goes down, or relatively down to previous periods. Well, massive unemployment, people get relatively poorer, capital goods like real estate prices fall relative to consumer goods, stock prices fall. The result is a general pessimism and overall demoralization amongst economic agents, amongst people, the working people, amongst businesses, entrepreneurs, and oftentimes amongst banks, as they suffer tremendous losses because businesses cannot properly service their bank debts. Is it clear so far? Okay, so we move on to number 5, forced unemployment. Well, forced unemployment is a typical consequence in a bust. Usually this simply means that there is a frictional unemployment. There is also, on top of that, a seasonal unemployment. Remember, seasonal unemployment is never related to the business cycle. That's the definition of seasonal. But you also have cyclical unemployment. And cyclical unemployment, this is a business cycle, and the business cycle causes cyclical unemployment. So if you'd remember many weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, when we were discussing unemployment, I said I'm not going to discuss cyclical unemployment. Well, now you get to see what the causes for cyclical unemployment are, why it results, when, and how. And there is yet another unemployment called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is part of the business cycle. The reason is that the economy is overall malstructured. For example, there has been, for the last 3, 4, 5 years, let's say from 2002 up until 2006, a wild real estate boom in the United States. So phenomenal investments in real estate. Well, mid to late 2006 and early 2007, the real estate sector itself is in a process of a bust. So you have a bloated sector with way too many workers, and this particular sector has to shrink and release labor. On the other hand, you have other sectors that feel underemployment. In other words, they are eager to employ, they got profits, and they want to employ, but they don't have the properly qualified people. A prominent industry today in the United States in 2006 is the energy industry. You shouldn't be starting today business if you want to get good quality salaries and wages for the next 20 years. You should be studying oil engineering. Well, if you're going to be studying economics, then you'd better stick to energy economics, because that's where the future is. All right, so that's an example of a structural unemployment, and it is the cause of it is that the economy is overall malstructured. One industry is too small and wants to expand but can't find the labor. Other industry is too large, it's got to shrink, so it's got to release the labor, and the other industry isn't absorbing them because a, let's say, mortgage broker isn't good to be hired and perform well in an oil industry as an oil engineer. Is it clear so far? All right, so we move on to consequence number 6. Highly specific capital goods will be abandoned. Well, what may be a highly specific capital good? Well, maybe a large stadium that was built with the intention to have, let's say, rock concerts. Well, people in a bust feel depressed and demoralized and pessimistic, don't feel too much about going to rock concerts. So it turns out that a stadium that's been designed for rock concert might not be as easy to convert into something else. A different example, maybe you have a repair shop for trucks. There has been the perception throughout the boom that the trucking industry will be booming and will be booming forever. So you have a whole bunch of shops to repair trucks. Well, when the trucking industry slows down and the repairs are not made simply because, let's say, demand and usage of trucks falls by 30%, so demand for shops will approximately fall by 30%. A shop for truck repair isn't easily fitted or retrofitted to be used to something else. So these will be considered relatively highly specific. Well, what is not so specific capital good? Well, cement. You just get ordinary cement in a bag, still in a dry, and you could have used it for a repair shop. You could use it for an ordinary shop, for a villa, for a hotel. It is not specific. It could have 1,000 or 10,000 different uses. So that's an example that is highly versatile. Lumber will be another example. Silver's got a couple of hundred different uses, so if it can't be used for one thing, it will be always melted and reused for something else. So the point to understand is that capital goods that can be retrofitted or changed, or their usage will be changed, it will be changed. But if it is highly specific in the bust, it may be completely abandoned and forgotten. Well, if it's completely abandoned and forgotten, as it happens with a big chunk of capital that has been built out throughout the boom, what is the result? The result is a wasted or squandered scarce resource, namely capital. It's been completely wasted. And this is the fundamental economic reasons why economic booms and busts make people relatively worse off. The reason? Scarce capital is impropriately or inappropriately invested during the boom and must be completely abandoned in the bust and thereby completely squandered. Clear so far? Any questions? Does it make sense? Okay, so we move on to number 7 is actually what I covered intuitively. It is the general impoverishment of society. Impoverishment, it is important to understand, is only in relative terms, not necessarily in absolute terms. Impoverishment in relative terms means relative to the case where there was steady growth without a boom and later on a bust. Let's give an example. Economy in a steady growth may have been growing at 4%, 4%, 4%, 4%, 4%, etc. In a boom, the economy may grow at 6%, 6%, 6%, and then the bust may be 1, 1, 1. Well, 1% still represents growth. 1% does not represent impoverishment in the absolute sense. People still get a little better, but they would have been relatively better off if they did not engage in the boom in the first place. Is it clear? Does that make sense? Okay, so what we have then, we also have as a consequence, number 8, reduced productivity of labor. Well, labor is as much productive as much technology it has on its hands. In other words, you may have a driver and he may be just pushing a cart that costs $50. He's going to be productive. But you give him a little car, he's going to be more productive. Give him a bus, he's going to be able to transport 10 times more people. You can give him an 18-wheel truck, and then he's going to be so much more productive. Or you can give him a huge crane, and he could be lifting maybe 10,000 times more weight than with his bare hands. In other words, productivity of workers depends on the available capital that they have, and if capital is squandered throughout the boom, and let's call it malinvested throughout the boom, and abandoned during the bust, it simply means that workers will have relatively less capital available to them, and that relatively less capital available will make them relatively less productive. Is it fairly clear? Does this make sense? Questions? All right, so we move on. Well, next consequence is logical. If people, meaning workers, are less productive, they will be getting lower wages. So the boom makes labor overall have relatively lower wages. In other words, the boom hurts capital. That's clear, simply because capital is lost in the process. It hurts entrepreneurs. That's clear, because they were misled by the boom and made a lot of investments in error. We call these malinvestments. But it also hurts labor in the process. In other words, there aren't very many winners in the process of a boom and a bust. A boom is based on credit expansion, and credit expansion is in itself inflationary. So the winners in a boom will be those same winners that win in an inflationary process. Remember our lecture on effects of inflation. So governments will be one of them, commercial banks or the inflators themselves, and so forth. But workers will definitely suffer out of a boom-bust process, but they suffer mostly during the bust. Is it clear? We'll move on. Okay, what we have next is consequence number 10. If people get to sense that businesses aren't able to pay their loans, during the boom, consumers also borrowed a lot to buy these TVs or flat screens or plasma TVs or luxury cars or furniture, whatever they bought, including lots of houses, apartments, and real estate. If people feel that they cannot pay back to the bank, and they can feel that they cannot pay back, businesses cannot pay back to the bank, then they get to fear of something else. They get to fear that their deposits are not safe with the bank. In other words, they get to think fairly simply but perfectly correctly, well, if the bank can't collect its money that it gave for mortgages and for investments for businesses, how can I get my money back if the bank doesn't get its money back? Well, the answer is it won't. So that's the case. People get to lose confidence in banks, and they'd say, well, I'm not going to lose much by walking to the bank and get my money out. Well, when everybody does this, walking to the bank to get their money out, what do we call this? Bank runs. Excellent. So that's exactly what it is. You get a loss of banking, of confidence in banking, and the results are bank runs. And bank runs only make a bad situation much worse. Well, could think much better, but I'm going to talk about that a little later. So, result is crisis of confidence. Oh, you can actually read it. Bank runs, and the results of bank runs are most often bank failures. Well, if banks have bank runs, they cannot extend credit, but they call upon to collect their credit back. The result is that there is a contraction of credit. In other words, you have a certain amount of credit that is outstanding, given to other people, and you have two processes. One is new credits are given, and then old credits are paid back. In a crisis of confidence, banks fear for their survival, so in those cases, banks usually halt giving credits out. In other words, they do not give credits, but at the same time, they call back on their borrowers to pay them back their loans so that they can service deposits to depositors. So the result is no loans are given out, all loans are paid back, the total volume of loans shrinks. When the volume of loans shrinks, we call this credit contraction. Credit expansion is the increase in the overall volume of loans, and credit contraction is the reduction or decrease in the overall volume. Well, a different way of saying is the same thing is used credit squeeze. It is also known in the markets as credit crunch. Credit crunch means people are eager to get credit, but they can't simply because banks fear to give credit because they need the money. They need the liquidity to service deposits. So another way of saying it is liquidity crunch and liquidity squeeze. So it's used, credit and liquidity are used interchangeably, and contraction or squeeze or crunch are also used interchangeably. So these terms are all used quite interchangeably, and they mean the same thing. It is hard to get credit while banks are calling on their loans. Okay? Is there any questions so far? All right, so we move on. We get to one of the most important topics, and that is necessary features of a bust. What does a necessary feature of a bust mean? It simply means what has to happen in order for a bust to be complete. In other words, you have a boom, and the boom does certain things, certain bad things. Usually the boom is considered to be good times. In economics, this is the exact opposite. Boom times are the bad times. Boom times are the bad times because that's when the mistakes are made. On the contrary, people feel and understand the bust as something bad and something terrible, while in reality it is the exact opposite. What the bust does is correct the previous mistakes in the boom. Well, what are the previous mistakes in the boom? Well, they're very simple. Malinvestments. So, how are these corrected? Well, number one, you can never possibly correct those mistakes unless you have increase in interest rates. They will induce a credit crunch or credit squeeze or credit contraction. Credit contraction is necessary in order to force liquidations. Liquidations also means something else. It doesn't simply mean selling out the asset for cash to pay back the bank. It also means that the asset is sold to the highest bidder. Who will be the highest bidder? The answer is simple. Those that can use best the capital as it is today, or those that can retrofit it best for some other use. In other words, what the liquidation does is to change the use of a poorly invested asset into a better use that will be more profitable. Moreover, not simply more profitable, but most profitable, because on an auction, the most efficient wins. In other words, if the most efficient wins, it means that a liquidation will change the use of the capital into its most efficient use. In other words, what a liquidation does is take an inefficiently invested and used asset and put it into a better efficient use, actually in its best currently available efficient use. So a liquidation is the process to enhance or increase efficiency and thereby productivity and thereby overall output. So liquidation is the reversal, or serves as the reversal of malinvestment. Malinvestment means you put it to usage to the wrong line of business. Liquidation is you put it back to the right line of business. Is it fairly clear, guys? Does it make sense? All right, so prices of low-order capital goods rise relative to prices of high-order capital goods. Essentially, you can think of it exactly opposite, as prices of high-order capital goods fall relative to low-order goods. It's the same thing. Now, it is important to understand, and usually it's not well understood, that it is not necessary that prices of high-order capital goods must fall in absolute terms. That's not necessary. What the distortion in the boom was that if these are the high-order capital goods and these are the low-order capital goods, high-order capital goods rose relative to low-order capital goods. What is necessary now is that they fall. Well, they may fall in the sense that high-order capital goods rise by 5%, low-order capital goods rise by 15%. The difference of 10% is essentially this readjustment of prices. In other words, what the boom did was distort the relative prices of consumer goods and capital goods, and what the bust must necessarily do is to restore back their ratio to normal. It may be by falling high-order prices, it may be by raising low-order capital goods prices, or it may be the combination of both. But the point is that the relative prices must change. This is crucial. This is crucial, and it's actually probably one of the, let's say, the extreme advantages of the Austrian theory of the business cycle over any other possible theory, because it allows, as I will explain a little later, actually it's in B, for stagflation. Stagflation is something completely impossible in the world of monetarists. And monetary theory throughout the 70s, which were stagflationary, went bankrupt. In other words, something happened in the 70s which monetarists simply could not explain, and the theory kind of like died. Same thing happened with Keynesians. Keynesians' stagflation was absolutely impossible. It was a complete theoretical impossibility. Well, they were all baffled and stunned in 71 and 2. And how could it be? We get both inflation and unemployment at the same time. So the 70s effectively bankrupted Keynesians. Well, it is this relativity of prices which makes the Austrian theory vastly superior, and also a whole bunch of other things, because it allows for a bust also to be stagflationary in nature. Okay, and the last one is, remember, the boom initiated a process of adjusting and shifting resources from low-order capital goods into high-order capital goods. Well, what must happen during the bust is to reverse the process and shift back those resources from high order back to low order. In other words, what the bust does is normalize the capital structure, put capital to their best possible uses, but also shift resources. This could be bricks, this could be workers, back from high order goods to low order capital goods. In other words, what the bust does is normalize things. But there is a whole lot more that I'm saying. I'm saying necessary. In other words, if a bust is to be complete, it must put the economy back to normal. And if you want to put it back to normal, you must reallocate back the resources. And you cannot possibly reallocate them unless you do the overall liquidations. And unless you have low order capital goods prices rise and rise substantially more than high order capital good prices, at least in relative terms. Is it clear so far? All right, so then we move on to the topic of types of busts. Well, busts, as you can see, guys, can be of three types. The first one is deflationary bust. Deflationary bust means that there is an outright credit contraction, and this outright credit contraction results in an overall decrease in the money supply. For example, this happened during the Great Depression. It is also associated most likely with crisis of confidence, bank runs, and bank failures. Deflationary bust is extremely painful, but there is a beauty in this whole thing. Deflationary busts make these necessary features of a bust satisfied real fast and real well. In other words, a deflationary bust is usually very sharp, very painful, but it doesn't last a long time. Could be a year, could be two. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk some more. It's coming to explain some more. Now, on the other hand, an inflationary bust is a bust where low order capital goods prices continue to rise in absolute terms, where overall money supply doesn't fall and doesn't shrink, so that what really is happening is you see a little bit of high order capital goods prices fall and a little bit of low order capital goods prices rise. So you see a combination of both, but the process is not sharp, but it's got a different problem. It is protracted. It can last 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 years. For example, and I'm probably going to spend, let's say, the week after that, last week, to talk more about the 70s. The boom of the 70s ended in 1969, and the bust began in 69, and it took 13 years to be over in 1982. So it took like 13 years. Usually, back in the old days, and for that you should remember our first lecture on monetary history, 19th century has recorded 15 booms and 15 busts. And those busts lasted like 6 months, 8 months, at most a year. A really terrible bust in the 19th century would last a year and a half. That's it. 1937 will be an example associated with a crisis. 1837, 1873. The point is, back in the old days, it took 12 months on average, 6-12 months for a bust to be over. Now, in a stagflationary environment, it could take 6 to 12 years and even more. It's a whole different topic to discuss, but I'll just mention it without explaining in detail. Maybe you'll remind me on our last lecture to talk more. Japan had a boom from 1980 all the way to 1990. It's a wild boom. And from 1990 up until 2007, even today, Japan is experiencing a bust. Everybody says and tells that this is a deflationary bust, which is a mystery to anybody who understands elementary economics, because Japanese money supply never went down. Japanese money supply has been steadily, a little bit, but going up. So, effectively, they did not get a deflationary bust, they get a classical stagflationary bust. And it's lasting now 17 years, and it still goes on, and it's not clear when. Well, it's actually clear when it's going to be over. It will be when these four simultaneously, all four satisfied, and the Japanese government has made sure that there are no liquidations in Japan. So, well, they've also made sure that the bust lasts for 17 years and still goes on. All right, so I'm moving now to the third type of bust. This is hyperinflationary bust. A hyperinflationary bust occurs for one simple reason. During the boom, the government doesn't want to let go of the boom. In other words, the government keeps on the gas pedal to the metal, meaning they continue to expand credit no matter what. They're not willing under any circumstances to stop the boom and let it turn into a bust. So, this means they gotta accelerate credit expansion. This in turn accelerates inflation, price inflation. This in turn accelerates people's expectations on inflation, and they sooner or later begin to drop their money demand close to zero. In other words, if the government is not willing to stop credit expansion at any cost, then hyperinflation is the people's weapon that they use to counter the government. And if the government doesn't stop it, then people stop the government by stopping to use government's money. Usually, well, not usually, always a hyperinflation results in a complete collapse of the monetary system. And usually people will take and get to use a different currency. If you guys remember 97, 98, in Bulgaria, when we had hyperinflation, what people would do, they would just switch to dollars and Deutschmarks. And for example, for 98, I was not in Russia, but literature says that 98, after the hyperinflation, Russia almost completely dollarized. In other words, 99% of the economy was driven by dollars. Transactions occurred through dollars, until the government decided that it's time to change the currency, replace it with a new currency, and promise they'll never print it again in those same, let's say, rates. Well, now Putin is doing the same thing all over again. He's printing at 40 or 50% rate. But the economy isn't collapsing because it's backed by oil, etc. I'm not going to discuss this. All right, so is this good enough for now? All right, we'll move on. Preventing depressions. The recipe is very simple when we guys understand what's causing a business cycle. The cause is credit expansion, so you gotta strike at the cause itself. Do not allow credit expansion. Now, people are oftentimes misled or misunderstand by saying you don't allow credit expansion. Well, you mean banks will not give credit? No, the answer is not. Banks will continue to give credit, but the credit will be fully backed by savings. In other words, they will not expand credit above and beyond the savings available in the economy. So the banking sector will continue to do so, but not at extreme levels as usually in a credit expansion. Point number 8. Okay, so the government screwed up. The government did allow credit expansion, and the government did allow the boom. Moreover, it fostered the boom. So, question is, bust sooner or later comes, and it always does so. What is the government to do? Well, usually there is the right policy and there is the wrong policy. We understand the theory so far, and by understanding the theory, it turns out to be very easy and simple to see what the appropriate policy is. Number one, in a bust, we want to have liquidations. And therefore, recipe number one is the government should not prevent and should not delay liquidations. Simple. The second one is, if the government reinflates, and reinflation is the process when, after a bust has begun and a credit crunch or credit squeeze has been initiated, the government begins or initiates a new policy to alleviate the credit crunch by allowing more credit on the market, thereby reversing the process of the bust back into a boom. Governments love to do this because they postpone the inevitable bust with all the unemployments, bankruptcies, etc., and all the negative economic and political things. So they love to reinflate in order to reinitiate a boom again. But in doing so, all that they do is effectively postpone the inevitable. But in the process of reinitiating the boom, they make matters worse, much worse. Why? Because, for one, they stopped the cleansing process or the reversal process. But if they reinitiate a boom, a whole lot more mistakes are made throughout this boom. This happened on 3 times during the 1970s. There was a 69-70 bust where the government got scared, so they reinflated and initiated a mini boom within the context of an overall bust from 69 to 82. Well, then the crisis in 73 came, so the bust reasserted itself with a major force in 73. Government got scared yet again, and they reinflated again. They alleviated the problem, they created a mini boom once again, but only for a short time. The economy lapsed again in a bust. There was a 79-80 bust. The government didn't let it run its course. They reinflated in 81, and ultimately when things got absolutely terrible and unbearable in 81, the government had to do the ultimate thing and let the bust run its course in 1982 so that the US gets its worst recession right after the Great Depression. In other words, all that government did was 3 times in a row it would reinflate in the hope of making things a little better, but all it did was make things worse and make things longer. Alright, is that fairly clear? That's on don't reinflate. Well, do not support wages. One of the most important points to understand, and that is of low-order capital goods and high-order capital goods, this readjustment includes labor. So sometimes, actually oftentimes in the process of a bust, labor prices must fall. In other words, wages must fall. And falling wages usually help the bust and help the economy readjust. If the government supports wages, it effectively halts the bust, or it effectively prevents the bust to continue in a normal manner. It just delays the inevitable. So usually it halts or prevents the readjustment process. Same thing with prices. Sometimes prices gotta fall for very many things, including real estate prices, including stock market prices. During the Great Depression, wheat prices, rice prices, all sorts of agricultural prices had to fall, and governments oftentimes usually choose to prevent falling prices. Another result or another policy that governments like to do is to stimulate consumption, and by stimulate consumption to support both prices and wages. Usually that's the most incorrect or inappropriate policy. Usually the problem during the bust is a shortage of savings and overconsumption. The appropriate policy is not simply not to stimulate consumption, but in every possible way to stimulate increased savings and lower consumption. Another thing that governments love to do is prevent bank runs. In the name of the people and in the name of defending people's money in banks, governments prefer to prevent bank runs in their benevolent thoughts and behavior, but in the course of doing so, they effectively lengthen the bust. And finally, what governments should do, as I already mentioned, they should encourage higher savings. Okay, so these are some of the don'ts that the governments shouldn't do. Essentially, what they shouldn't do is should not interfere with the readjustment process. In other words, the bust is a process of readjustment, and what government shouldn't do is mess up the process or stop or prevent the process from working. Is it clear, guys? Does it make sense? All right, we say you governments do the exact opposite, do they? All right, so we move on. I'll get to that. Let's scroll down a little bit. Okay, so what are the implications for central banking to prevent the devastating consequences of the bust? Okay, so now I'm switching back to topic of central banking from many lectures ago, maybe 4 weeks ago or so. And what central bank is supposed to do, number one, is synchronize credit expansion. If it is, remember to defend the interest of commercial banks. And second, what it has to do is to be the lender of last resort during the inevitable crisis of confidence. In other words, if there is a central bank, and if the central bank helps and supports credit expansion, of course, that's what a central bank always does, because this way it promotes higher profits for commercial banks, then when the bust comes, what the central bank should do in order to prevent the comeuppance of commercial banks is to be their lender of last resort. In other words, to bail them out. Now, you have to understand, bailing out commercial banks is good for the banks and good for the bankers, but it is bad for the people and for the overall process of readjustment or a bust. You understand? That's fairly clear, okay? And we have 10-15 more minutes. Let's scroll back to 8. Okay, so now we get back to this short story. What made the Great Depression great? It's a simple question. In other words, Great Depression would have been an ordinary depression, like any other depression in, let's say, the 19th century. It would have lasted maybe a year, maybe 2 years. What made the Great Depression great? Any guesses, guys? Well, it's amazingly simple. The government implemented all the wrong policies. During the Great Depression, there was a bust, and the bust was of deflationary nature. So the first thing that the government did was in every possible way to prevent liquidations. On score A, the government did the wrong thing. By preventing liquidation, it prevented the readjustment of the economy and the redeployment of capital to better uses. Moreover, the next thing that the government did was all throughout 29 and 30 and 31 and 32, even though it was relatively unsuccessful, the government tried extremely hard to reinflate. It couldn't, but it tried phenomenally hard. What they did was they broadened and increased the monetary base at a rapid rate. Broad money supply was shrinking because the multiplier was shrinking even faster than the monetary base. Let me write this out for you. What you have is broad money, which is M3, and broad money is equal to monetary base times the multiplier. So what the government did was reinflate madly by raising sharply monetary base. Well, what really happened was the market was reacting in its appropriate way. The multiplier shrank even faster. So the government would have helped most if it actually shrank the monetary base and thereby accelerate the overall process of bankruptcies, busts, etc. Instead, it did exactly the opposite. It did the worst possible thing. Number 3, the government had its major policy to support worker wages at all costs. It subsidized unemployed people. It instituted a lot of different policies. Again, you will do best, I'm making a side note here, you'll do best by all means to sit and read America's Great Depression, that book that I told you about, Rothbard. This is the book that opened my eyes many years ago, that made me an economist, and I'm hoping if you guys read it, it will most likely make you economists too, because not just pure naked theory. Theory is only one chapter there. It is the story that's interesting, all the gory details of how it was done, what was done, why it was done, what was the motivation, how things went wrong, and so forth. The point is back to supporting wages. Government did it in every possible way. It was successful to support wages and thereby make the Great Depression great. All right? The next thing that the government did was support prices. Here is something that may sound a little bit absurd, but governments really do that things. Wheat prices and corn prices during the Great Depression were falling because in a depression what people do is increase their savings rate. When they increase their savings rate, their demand falls. And if demand falls, prices of those goods will fall. In an overall monetary contraction, prices will fall even faster. So, wheat, corn, etc. prices, meat prices were falling, and what the government did in order to support the prices would effectively run a budget deficit. In other words, effectively print money, buy out the agricultural goods, and then throw them in the ocean or burn them. In other words, you had a phenomenal scarcity. You had misery. You had people hungry, suffering, unemployment, etc. In terrible times, the government does the worst thing, prints the money, buys the goods, and then burns them or throws them in the river or in the ocean, so as to support prices. Well, at any point in time, it should be perfectly clear that by taking an economic good and destroying it, it is not possible to increase in any way economic welfare. Destruction always lowers welfare. and you should never believe otherwise. I was in the US 2001 when September 11 occurred. An economist stood up and said, wow, this destruction is great because it's going to create a whole bunch of jobs. We're going to spend 100 billion, 50 for each tower to rebuild them. It's going to create jobs. So that's really good. And these people are nuts. They're crazy. Actually, they're just paid people who have no clue what they're talking about. You got to understand, that's one of the simplest lessons you got to learn in elementary macro. Destruction never ever increases prosperity and welfare of people. Destruction is destruction or destructive and always lowers it. And just making jobs to rebuild them isn't creating prosperity. It's just, as I told you before, you can get one group of people to dig holes, the other group to fill them up. Sure, you have jobs for the whole Chinese world, right? But it doesn't create wealth. It doesn't create welfare. It doesn't create something that people are willing to pay for it. So it has to be productive in order to be creating wealth. And by destroying it and then rebuilding it, you're not creating wealth. You're just wasting wealth and scarce resource. Is that clear so far? All right, we move on. Well, do not subsidize unemployment. Well, that's exactly what the government did. It subsidized effectively unemployment. If you pay unemployed people to stay unemployed, they will not get on the job market, on labor market, and underbid their working colleagues. So if wages are, let's say, $1 an hour, they were back then a lot less than that because inflation was, prices were a lot lower. If $1 an hour, if you're unemployed, you may be willing to work for 80 cents. Well, if the government pays you 70, why should you go to work and get 80? Well, it's not worth it for a lot of people. So governments shouldn't subsidize unemployment. Quite the opposite. They should not pay anything to unemployed people so that those that become unemployed are eager to get back to work, maybe at a lower wages. And if they get to work at a lower wages, something else will happen. Readjustment of wages. So that will be effectively good. Good in the sense that it's going to make the bust faster and more efficient and over sooner rather than later. Not to prevent bank runs, well, that's exactly what the federal government did, at least successfully throughout 1930 and then 31. In 1932, it really couldn't prevent the massive bank runs, so a lot of thousands of banks went bankrupt in the process of that. But the government could have let them fall in 1929 or maybe in early 1930 to be over. Effectively, what really happened was, as soon as bank runs were successful, meaning the banks went bankrupt, just a few short months later, the depression was over. The government could have let bank runs happen in 1930 and have, in 1930, in less than 12 months, the Great Depression over. Instead, it prolonged it a whole lot longer. And then encouraged higher savings. They actually did the exact opposite. They encouraged people to spend more. Now, there is one last thing that made the Great Depression great, and that is to reinflate. I already mentioned that the government tried hard to reinflate by increasing the monetary base. But this was during the first phase between 1929 and 1932. Finally, after trying for a long time and after all the bankruptcies occurred in 1932, the government successfully reinflated from 1932 or 1933 all the way to 1937. So for 4 years, the government successfully reinflated and thereby still halted the Great Depression in the sense that the bust, they terminated it prematurely in 1932. So what really had to happen is another recession or bust to kick in 37, more like 38, to finish the job that the government prematurely aborted in 32. So the point is that they reinflated for 4 years, and that's what also helped make the Great Depression great. To summarize and put it differently, what the government did throughout the Great Depression was did absolutely everything wrong. And that's how the government helped to make the Great Depression truly great. Is it clear? All right. Well, if you get to study the 70s, you'll see that they did more or less the same thing. All right. Now, any other questions? Any questions that you may have? All right. So what I'm thinking is next week we'll cover fiscal policy, and for the last week I'll get back with some more stories and real examples of booms and busts to get the applied side of business cycles, because so far what I've been doing is mostly theory. Anything else? All right, we're done for today. Okay.